Hey everyone, Ian Plant here, and in this episode of Photo Talk, I have a great interview with professional photographer Charles Needle, who takes these amazing macro and impressionistic photos. He offers plenty of tips to help you make your own artistic photos. So if you want to learn more, stay tuned. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and ring the bell so you always know when we drop our next helpful video. Hey everyone, I am professional photographer Ian Plant, and my goal, my mission in life is to help you become the best photographer that you can be. And I am honored and privileged to be joined by some of the best photographers on the planet. And today we're joined by an incredibly talented photographer. He makes these wonderful abstract and impressionistic images. Charles Needle, welcome to Photo Talk.
Thanks, Ian. Pleasure to be here.
Well, it's a pleasure to have you on. How you doing?
I'm doing great. We had a little snow today here in Colorado, earliest snowfall ever. But other than that, I'm doing great.
Yeah, up here in Minnesota, we've had a cold snap for the past few days. It hasn't quite gotten down below freezing, so we don't have any snow yet. And I think it's going to be full on summer again by the end of the week.
Exactly. Same scenario here.
Yeah, it's some wacky weather right now. It seems like the whole world is in total chaos at the moment.
That's right. Anything's possible in 2020, right?
Well, why don't we start off by getting a little information about you. Tell us about your background, how you got into photography, and how you got into being a professional photographer and how long you've been doing that.
So I've been shooting professionally and teaching photography for over 20 years, and it all really kind of started through a chronic illness that I had. I had what turned out to be like yuppie flu later, and it's all totally fine now. I teach and travel the world, and I really credit photography with a big part of that healing. So anyway, it's been a little over 20 years, and one of my greatest workshops that I do is taking people into Monet's garden with private access. And I've been doing that for almost 30 years, actually, with that. So it's just an honor and a privilege to be able to do that.
So you take photographers into Monet's garden and then you make very impressionistic Monet-like photographs. Is that correct?
Yes, I actually sort of developed a lot of the techniques while I was in Monet's garden and just kept working with things like intentional camera movement as well as multiple exposures. And it's something that really excites me. And I think the multiple exposure feature on a camera is one of the most underutilized creative tools that's out there, available for everyone now. And you can even do some of this stuff on your smartphone. And I've recently been playing around a lot with doing impressionistic imagery using my smartphone. So I have an iPhone 11 Pro Max.
I have yet to upgrade. I'm still like on an iPhone 6 or something like that, and it's cracked.
Okay.
I mean, I've dropped it about a half a dozen times, and it's pretty much on its, like, the battery doesn't even really work anymore. Like, I constantly have to be charging this thing, and I know I should just upgrade my phone, but I really haven't gotten around to it. It's just like kind of low on my priority list right now.
That's okay. That's okay. You can still do everything I'm talking about using that phone as well. So
that's true. And, you know, it is surprising how good the photos are that you can take with your phone. But I think a lot of people would be surprised to hear a professional photographer talking about doing iPhone photography. So tell me what it is about iPhone photography that you find so attractive.
Well, if nothing else, I like using the phone just as a visual sketch pad for me. It really helps train my eye, helps me to see better, helps me to really just notice and appreciate the art in my life. I was making tuna fish the other day, and I made an image of the little water drops on the celery, and just things like that. And so it's always with you, the saying of the best camera is always with you. And now with the printing technology and software like AI Gigapixel, we can make huge prints from iPhones, and you put that up next to a DSLR image, and it's very hard to tell the difference. So it's just very exciting to me to have the portability. And the other reason I like it is it sort of dumbs it down, if you will. Like, I don't have to think too much about f-stops and shutter speeds. There are a lot of apps that you can use to manually control things like that. But I really enjoy just concentrating mostly on the composition aspect of photography using my phone.
Well, on occasion, I do take out my phone and make snapshots of things. And sometimes those snapshots are as good as the shots I'm taking with my professional camera, but I never admit to anyone that I took that shot with my iPhone. I feel like
Well,
I'm
exactly.
embarrassed.
Yeah, totally. And one of and this kind of gets into my philosophy about photography. I mean, I really believe we need to make images for ourselves first and foremost. It's great to shoot for like a camera club competition or a client or things like that, but what's going to really feed your heart and soul is, photographing for yourself. So the phone for me kind of gives me that freedom. And so that's another reason I really enjoy it.
Yeah, and it occurs to me that my personal embarrassment about using the phone is probably just the wrong way to think about it. I mean, these are all just creative tools. And yeah, sure, my digital
Right.
camera might be in some ways a better creative tool if I want a specific output, like a giant print or something like
Sure.
that. There's
Sure.
really nothing stopping you from making great photos with just about any sort of camera. Even like a really bad camera, you can still take amazing photos with it.
Exactly, which brings up the point about all of these tools. I mean, we have to remember all this gadgetry and cameras and tripods and all of that. It's tools that help us to translate our creative vision. So, in the end, it really is more about training your eye to see and to really see deeper and to just kind of go beyond documentation. That's a big part of what I do when I teach macro photography also.
Well, let's drill down a little bit deeper and we can take the different types of photography that you do separately. Let's start off with macro photography. So what is it about macro that you like so much?
Well, I think when I had my illness, I was particularly drawn to macro because I couldn't travel to grand landscape scenery. I really basically had my own backyard as my sort of studio, and I like the idea that I could control the lighting, control composition. I really work a lot with flowers and plants and things like that, and it's great to have things potted so that you can kind of control depth of field and all of that. So it was having that control and also just discovering an amazing tiny universe within, let's say, a flower or whatever subject I was working with. And of course, that was very healing and restorative for me too as a photographer.
So, I mean, one of the challenges of macro, it seems to me, would be the process of visualizing what the final photograph would look like. I mean, when, for example, shooting landscapes or something like that, you kind of see the landscape with your eyes and you end up translating it in a fairly literal way with the camera. Like, you're shooting with a lot of depth of field. And so what you see with your eyes is not going to be exactly what you get with the camera, but you can kind of visualize it. You can see what it's going to look like just by looking at the landscape. But with a macro subject, a lot of different variables can radically change the way your subject looks. So I imagine it might be a bit of a challenge, like figuring out in your mind ahead of time what your macro subject's going to look like, and then trying to translate that by getting down and dirty and into the shot and working through the techniques to get the final photograph to look like the vision you have in your head. Tell me a little bit more about that process.
Yeah, so it's really a form of meditation almost for me. I mean, you're really slowing down a lot. I mean, you do that, of course, when you're making landscape images too. And I like to think of a macro scene as kind of a little miniature landscape. I mean, that is what it is. All the same rules about composition, lighting, exposure apply. You just have a much smaller space that you're working in. And so a lot of it has to do with, being able to, in your mind, kind of preview the depth of field, how much depth of field there's going to be, and just, learning how very little minute changes, whether it's slightly recomposing or, just changing your camera angle slightly can make all the difference. Every little movement is completely magnified tenfold when you're working close up like that. So it takes a lot of patience. You can't just, kind of walk up and say, got it, and I don't think that's the case with landscape photography either by any means. You really have to kind of scout out where you're going and find the right camera angle, lighting, etc. But think that it's a great exercise for all landscape photographers to try macro, even if they decide it's not their thing, because it's going to, again, train your eye to really see nuances in a scene.
So it seems to me that macro photography requires a healthy dose of patience and really sturdy knee pads.
That's for sure. Yes. I actually sell macro knee pads in my workshops. People can order them from me if they're interested. They're actually for gardening. But you're right. A set of knee pads is critical, whether you're working in a public space that's paved or even, your own dirt sort of surface. Yeah, definitely important.
Now, normally I don't really like talking about gear that much, but for macro photography, it seems to me that there's probably a few specialized pieces of gear that every photographer should consider getting if they want to get serious about macro.
Yes. So ideally, in a perfect world, you really want to get a dedicated macro lens. So it's usually a fixed focal length lens. I shoot with Nikon. I started with Nikon back in the film days. So I go with the 200 macro because it has a lens collar that I'm able to actually loosen the collar and change my composition without having to flop over, especially if I've worked like a half hour, to get a certain composition just right. It's really nice to be able to flip the camera vertical or in any other orientation. Sometimes I end up in these funky, diagonal positions because really there's no true horizon necessarily when you're doing more abstract macro work. So having a lens like that, now if money is an issue, then you could go with something more like, I also own the 105 macro, and in the Canon world it would be the 100 macro or the 180. Those would be the two lenses in the Canon world. And so I'm shooting with a D800, so it's a full frame camera. And I just enjoy being able to really get that kind of one-to-one magnification with that. And then that being said, if you want to kind of throw another log on the fire and take it a step further, I really, really enjoy working with close-up lenses. The one that I have been using is the 500D close-up lens that Canon makes. It's essentially like they sliced the front element of a lens off. And it's a real high quality dual element glass filter, and it screws right onto the end of your macro lens, or you could even put it on the end of your telephoto lens. If let's say you're out hiking or something, you don't want to lug a second lens for macro, you could actually use that filter, or it's also referred to as a diopter, onto the end of your macro or your telephoto lens. And that would turn that telephoto lens into a lens that focuses closer, but not necessarily a true one-to-one macro lens, but it's better than nothing. And the other reason I like it is it has no distortion on the edges with that particular filter. And it's also, in my view, a little better than using extension tubes because you're not going to be losing light the way you might lose light if you used extension tubes. I do use extension tubes from time to time, but more often than not, I find myself reaching for that 500D.
So you did mention before that with macro, even very small adjustments of your camera position can have a big impact on how the scene looks. Are you using a focusing rail to kind of minimize the amount of motion? And sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, you can invest in a focusing rail. In my opinion, I don't think it's necessary. I actually have the head of my tripod. It's a Really Right Stuff BH55, I think. And so I use the head on there that has the little screw knob. So if I'm working with my 200 macro, I can actually just loosen that knob and move the camera back and forth because that lens has a foot. So if I go forward or backward, it is similar to what an extension rail would be. Or focusing rail. So that's my workaround for that. But it's certainly great, especially if you want to do a lot of focus stacking. It can come in handy for that. I tend to make images that have a lot of selective focus where things get very mushy in the background. I love that technical term, mushy. And I just really enjoy exploring the abstract part of subjects, edges, curves, lines, shapes, that sort of thing. And so if you want to get into O'Keefe world like that, then go for it if you're shooting flowers.
Yeah, I mean,
Especially.
certainly selective focus will, lend itself to a much more abstract look for your photographs. But when you're doing your more abstract impressionistic photographs, you're taking it beyond just selective focus. My understanding is that you're doing a lot of intentional camera movement and multiple exposures and things of that nature. Can you talk more about that?
Yeah, sure. So when I'm making impressionistic images, I find myself reaching for my 70 to 200 lens. I use that lens for probably 95% of my what I call intimate landscape work. And I'm actually drawn to that lens even with just straight landscape photography. For some reason, I just see the world more intimately like that. It's hard for me to use, a 14 mil lens very often. And that's a good exercise for me to actually force myself to use that lens and make images, not necessarily close-ups. But anyway, that's just the way I see the world. So that 70 to 200 just kind of came naturally to me. And one of the reasons for using that lens is we really kind of want a more intimate landscape and compression of space. And the two factors to look for when you're wanting to make something impressionistic, whether it's with multiple exposures or just long exposures doing intentional camera movement, are color contrast and tonal contrast. Those are the two most important ingredients for an impressionistic image. So anyway, but I use that lens and I'm almost always set at a small aperture because I want to kind of mimic the look of small brush strokes like you would see in a painting or even kind of a pointillistic look. So I've done things with, as few as 3 exposures or all the way up to my camera can do up to 10 multiple exposures in camera. And that's one of the really awesome things about having a camera that has built-in multiple exposure capability is that you can view it on the LCD within seconds after you've shot your 10 frames, let's say, and the camera just automatically blends them all together and knows exactly the right exposure to use, assuming that you have the right settings. And one of the settings, at least for a Nikon, is to make sure that auto gain is turned on. And that's kind of the magic elf inside the camera, if you will, that's going to do all the exposure calculations and make it where you don't have to underexpose each frame in order to make one final image. And a lot of people played around back in the day with multiple exposures, probably in the slide film days. You would take several images and then mount them all in one single slide mount, sandwiched together. So it's that same idea. It's different from HDR. We're not talking about HDR here. It's completely different. You're basically just layering however many exposures you want all together at the indicated meter reading. And I've got a book called Impressionistic Photography that outlines all the step-by-step process of making images like this. If you're curious and want to learn more, you can go to the website impressionisticphotographybook.com, and that's where you can order that book. I've actually sold over 1,000 copies of that book already. I self-published it, and it's in its second printing, and it's continuing to sell like hotcakes. And especially during this pandemic, I'm getting several book orders a day, it seems like, on that book. So it's a really awesome sort of field guide. It's a pretty picture book too, but it's way more than that. It's a how-to book that really walks you through how to make painterly images in your camera, whether it's using long exposures or multiple exposures. And even there's one chapter there on the phone as well. So how you can do this stuff with the phone.
And this is a real print book, not an ebook.
It is. It's a paperback that's, so.
You don't see many of those these days.
What's that?
I said you don't see many of those these days.
Yeah, exactly. I know. An actual book that you can hold in your hand and smell, right? So, and I have another book that's about to go out of print. That was published by Amherst Media, and that one's called Tiny Worlds. And that one's available from me as well. So if you want to grab a copy of that, I've only got a handful left. But let me know if you're interested in that. My website's currently under construction, but you can email me if you're interested in ordering a copy of Tiny Worlds.
And you also have an ebook on macro photography.
I do, yes. And that's called Creative Macro Photography. And the subtitle of that one is Professional Tips and Techniques. And that's available on your website. So you can download. That's a 159-page ebook that goes over everything you would need to know about macro and how to kind of take your macro photography beyond just straightforward documentary, here is a flower type photography. There's a whole chapter in there on all these really cool setups you can do in your backyard or on your kitchen table. It's got illustrated examples showing you how to do all the setups and the lighting and so forth for things like that. So it's a great sort of thing to do when we're stuck indoors right now.
So I wanted to delve a little deeper into one of the techniques you use for your impressionistic photos, and that is intentional camera movement. So there probably are some of the viewers here who know a little bit about that process, but some who don't really know what that is. So could you, for the benefit of the folks who have never done intentional camera movement, can you explain what it is, why you do it, and how you do it?
Sure. So it's a lot of fun. A lot of you may have done intentional camera movement unintentionally and immediately erased the image, and that's all fine and good, but maybe you won't erase it quite as quickly after you hear what I'm about to say. So essentially, it's setting your camera so that you can get the longest possible exposure, or at least an exposure time of, even as slow as a half second. Or sometimes I'll do a 10-second exposure. So however you need to set the camera to get there, usually it involves a low ISO, stopping your lens all the way down, using a polarizer if you've got one, and even using a variable neutral density filter if you happen to have one of those. And so we're basically trying to restrict the amount of light that's coming into the camera, so that you can have longer to move the camera around during that shutter speed time. So you can make images, especially with trees. That's a great subject to practice with at first. So if you've done your straight, intimate landscape, your wide angle landscape, you kind of got all that out of your system, instead of packing up your bag, you may want to try a few intentional camera movement images of your landscape. So with trees, you would basically just, what I do is use the ball head so that I can control how much tension there is in the ball head. And it varies the look you're going to get as to how much you want to move the camera. But essentially, you're going to be swiping the camera up or down, or even both ways if there's enough time. And the speed at which you move the camera is going to impact the final image. So if you swipe up really, really fast, you're going to get these, long streaks that don't have a whole lot of definition to them or texture, but it does create a really cool effect. Or if you move it very, very slowly, you can sometimes pick up the texture of let's say if there's a tree bark or whatever might be involved, or if there's other foliage on the forest floor. Let's say if you're working in a forest, you'll pick some of that up if you move it a little bit slower. And you can even squiggle the camera, or rotate and zoom. I cover all this in my book, but it's really fun to literally, what we're doing is kind of do-si-doing with our camera, to borrow the phrase from Freeman Patterson, who's one of my dear friends and one of my mentors as well. So it's a lot of fun, and I encourage everyone to try it. And you can even do this with your phone. You do have to have an app called Slow Shutter to be able to do that, but it's a lot of fun.
So what's your goal artistically with these impressionistic photos? I mean, what are you looking for? It seems to me one of the benefits of
that's a great question. Yeah. I'm glad you asked, because it's one thing to just kind of do these things and get it out of your system and say, oh yeah, I rotated and zoomed and I created this really cool image or whatever. But we really have to kind of pull back and think, why am I doing this in the first place? Other than just, it's very cool. So one of the things I'm trying to always convey to my viewer in my work is a feeling or an expression of how I was feeling when I was there in the scene. So it's a great way to kind of express a feeling, and it takes a while to kind of get to that level with your photography. But if you just keep practicing and practicing and practicing, then you'll get there. I always say photography is a performance art, just like dance, music, anything like that. You just have to keep practicing and practicing. I'm sure you've told your audience that a lot.
Yeah, so. Practice makes perfect. Practice is the best thing you can do to improve your photography.
Yeah. And one of the other thrills about impressionistic photography for me is how unpredictable it is. There's no two images that are ever going to be identical. So there's this element of surprise. And even, the lighting can change from second to second. So, and that's one of the things I forgot to bring up earlier. Yeah, tonal contrast, color contrast, that's all important. But one of the really nice things about doing that type of imagery is you can actually shoot at high noon, when everybody else is packed up, or maybe they're doing macro over in, a shady spot. You can actually make some awesome impressionistic images when the light is like super harsh and contrasty. So try it under those lighting conditions too, as well as dramatic side lighting or back lighting and, all the other types of lighting. So it frees you up to, more possibilities.
Well, it seems to me that shape is something that's also important to this impressionistic type of photography. Contrast and color are definitely very important, but you want to create abstract shapes with your camera movement that will give the viewer something to glob onto in your composition. Is that correct?
That's correct. Exactly. Yep. Whether it's a shape or, a line or a texture, a lot of times you're creating textures. And a lot of times you can actually take the texture you created and, layer it with some other very straight literal image, whether it's a landscape image or a close-up of a flower that's tack sharp, and layer that sort of dreamy texturized look with the straight image and get even more abstract that way and make more impressionistic painterly images that way.
You mentioned Monet earlier. Are you drawing inspiration from impressionistic painters? And if so, who would you recommend?
Yeah, so of course, I consider Claude Monet to be one of the masters. A lot of people call him the father of Impressionism. So I would study his work and really all the impressionistic painters of that time. Renoir and Seurat and, it's great for us to study painters as photographers. And maybe all of us as photographers are frustrated painters in some way. So, but now, you can literally use your camera as a paintbrush by trying some of these things. So yeah, definitely check out paintings and the works of painters.
It seems to me that in non-pandemic times, you are doing photo workshops all around the world. So why don't you talk more about that? Tell us a little bit about the amazing places that you go and the things that students can expect to learn.
Sure. So I enjoy taking people to lots of gardens in particular. I do landscape photography as well in other locations besides gardens and do workshops there. But next year I'll be going to Holland, to Keukenhof in April, and then that will be followed by Monet's Garden in France. And as I mentioned before, that's kind of my most popular workshop. We go in there with private access. And all my workshops, people are really excited to learn not only about impressionistic photography, but also diving deeper on macro and learning how to just use your camera in general in ways that you might not have thought were possible, especially with a lot of the creative techniques. And then the other workshops I'll be doing are Bouchard Gardens in Canada, if we can get into Canada. Hopefully we'll be able to get in there. And then that's actually my favorite garden in all of North America. If you've never been there, I highly recommend it. It's in British Columbia. And then I also will be taking people to Longwood Gardens, most likely, and doing a private Gardens of Cape Cod workshop on the East Coast, and then a little bit in Colorado as well. There's a botanic garden here, but I also plan to do workshops with the wildflowers here in Colorado and teach people impressionistic ways of rendering wildflowers. So anyway, I do like straight literal photography too, but enjoy just helping people realize they can see in completely different ways they never thought were possible using their camera or their smartphone. I've had workshop participants come with just a phone. So I love taking people from whatever skill level they're at and taking them to the next level.
Wow, those sound like a lot of fun, and it seems to me like there's lots to learn on your workshops. I know that we've learned a lot from you today, Charles, so thank you very much for sparing some time and talking with us. This has been very illuminating. I really appreciate you coming on.
Thank you. It's been an honor and a privilege to be here, and I really appreciate you having me, and love to see a lot of people watching on future workshops or even some online classes I'm planning to do.
All right, well, I encourage everyone to check it out. Charles Needle, thank you so much for appearing on Photo Talk. It's been great. Talk to you later. Hey guys, thanks for watching. Here are a few more great videos that I think you'll enjoy and learn a lot from. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and get notified by ringing that bell so that you always know when we drop our next helpful video.